The air was dry, filled with the scent of rust and decay. Nathan Carter adjusted his backpack and stepped over the rubble of an abandoned building. He had been searching for supplies all day but found nothing useful. This planet was a graveyard of a war long over, and the only things left behind were ruins and silence. As he moved through the wreckage, something caught his attention. A faint sound, barely audible. A weak, ragged breath. He turned his head sharply, scanning the shadows. There, half hidden under a collapsed wall, was a figure. Nathan stepped closer, his hand instinctively hovering near his sidearm. The figure twitched, trying to move away, but too weak to do so. When he finally got a clear look, his eyes widened in surprise. It was an alien woman. Her skin was a deep violet, marked with faint bioluminescent lines that barely glowed in the dim light. Her silver hair was tangled and dirty, and her clothes, what was left of them, were torn and covered in dust. But what shocked Nathan the most were her eyes. Large, golden, filled with exhaustion and hunger. She was starving. Nathan slowly crouched, keeping his movements non-threatening. The alien woman's breathing was shallow, her body trembling. He could see the sharp bones of her shoulders, the hollow look of her cheeks. She was dying. Reaching into his bag, he pulled out a ration bar and unwrapped it. The simple scent of food made the alien woman flinch, her golden eyes locking onto the bar. But she didn't reach for it. Instead, she glared at him, her face hardening despite her obvious weakness. Nathan sighed. "It's food," he said, holding it out. "You need to eat." The alien didn't move. She stared at him with suspicion, as if she expected some kind of trick. Nathan took a bite himself, chewing slowly. Then he broke the bar in half and placed one piece on the ground between them. She hesitated. Then, with a sharp breath, she snatched the food with shaking hands and bit into it. The first bite made her freeze. Her golden eyes widened in shock, and for a moment, she just sat there, chewing. Then, as if realizing that this was real, she devoured the rest hungrily. Nathan watched her in silence. This wasn't just hunger. This was desperation, survival on the edge. She licked the last crumbs from her fingers, then looked up at him. Her glare had softened, replaced with something else. Confusion. "Why?" Her voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. Nathan shrugged. "Because you needed it." The alien woman kept staring at him, as if trying to understand. For the first time in a long while, someone had helped her, and she couldn't believe it. The alien woman sat still, staring at Nathan. The last crumbs of the food were gone, but she still looked confused. It was clear. She didn't understand why a human would help her. Nathan didn't push for a conversation. He simply reached into his bag again and pulled out a water bottle. Without a word, he unscrewed the cap and took a sip himself before placing it on the ground between them. She hesitated. Her golden eyes flicked between him and the bottle. Then, slowly, with trembling hands, she picked it up. The moment the water touched her lips, she drank like she had been in a desert for weeks. Gulp after gulp, she emptied half the bottle before coughing. Nathan resisted the urge to help her. He knew she wouldn't appreciate it. Finally, she wiped her mouth with the back of her hand. She still looked weak, but there was a tiny spark of life in her now. Nathan leaned back, resting against a broken wall. "What's your name?" he asked. The alien woman hesitated. Then, after a long pause, she muttered, "Syra." Nathan nodded. "Syra. All right. You alone?" Her jaw clenched. She looked away, silent. That was answer enough. Nathan sighed. He didn't know much about the Veleri, her species, but he had heard stories. They were proud, warriors by nature, and they didn't trust humans. The war between her people and another alien race had ended months ago, and now this planet was nothing more than a forgotten battlefield. Syra must have been left behind, just like these ruins. "You're human," she said suddenly, her voice still rough. Nathan smirked. Yeah, figured that out, ha. She narrowed her eyes. Your kind doesn't help us. He raised an eyebrow. And your kind doesn't usually sit half dead under rubble. But here we are. Syra's expression tightened, but she didn't argue. She knew he was right. A moment of silence passed between them. The wind howled through the broken buildings, carrying dust and the distant sound of metal creaking. Then, softly, Syra spoke. My squad was attacked. We fought, but the others didn't make it. Nathan noticed the way her hands curled into fists. She was holding back emotions, grief, anger, maybe even shame. Your own people, he asked carefully. She hesitated, then shook her head. No, not them. That meant someone else was still out there. Nathan exhaled. This just got more complicated. Syra looked at him again, her golden eyes burning with curiosity now. You're strange, human, she said. Nathan smirked. Yeah, I get that a lot. Syra didn't smile, but she didn't look away either. For the first time, she didn't see him as an enemy. The fire crackled softly between Nathan and Syra, casting long shadows across the ruined settlement. The night air was cold, and the silence of the planet felt heavy, almost suffocating. Nathan watched Syra, still sitting across from him, her expression unreadable. She had eaten, she had drunk, but something was still off. There was still a wall between them, a wall built from distrust and pride. He could feel it. So, what now? Nathan asked, breaking the quiet. Syra's gaze snapped to him. Her golden eyes flashed, but she didn't answer right away. Instead, she simply tilted her head, like she was studying him. You helped me, and now you ask what now? She said, her voice still rough but stronger than before. Nathan raised an eyebrow. I figured we could talk. Maybe figure out how to get off this dead planet, unless you're planning to sit here and wait for the scavengers to find us. Syra stiffened at the mention of scavengers. She had seen them earlier, dangerous, ruthless people who lived off the wreckage of this war-torn world. Nathan didn't blame her for the unease in her eyes. Those scavengers wouldn't hesitate to take what they wanted, no matter who they had to kill to get it. I don't trust you, human, she said bluntly, staring at the fire. Nathan chuckled softly. Good. I don't trust you either. But right now, we don't have a choice, do we? For a moment, there was silence again, but it wasn't the same as before. This time, it wasn't filled with hostility. It was almost like mutual understanding. Syra, despite her pride, was beginning to see him as a person, not just another human she should hate. Why did you help me? She asked, her voice softer now. Nathan shifted, leaning back against the broken wall. I told you already. You needed it. Syra snorted. But why? Humans don't help Valeri. He didn't answer immediately. The truth was, he didn't really know. He had grown up hearing all the stories. The Valeri were feared, a race of proud warriors who had little interest in anyone but themselves. They were enemies, and humans and Valeri didn't mix. Yet here he was, sitting beside one who had been abandoned, left to starve and die alone. You're right, Nathan said finally, his voice quiet. We don't. But I don't see the point in letting you die when I can do something about it. Her eyes flickered to him, her gaze sharp. You're different, she murmured. Nathan shrugged, looking at the stars above. Yeah, I hear that a lot too. Syra studied him for a long time, her gaze almost piercing. She wasn't used to this. She wasn't used to humans being kind or offering help without expecting something in return. It made her uneasy, and yet she felt something else growing inside her. Curiosity. Finally, she spoke again, but this time her voice held a softer edge. You're strange, human. Nathan smiled a little. I'll take that as a compliment. There was a brief silence before Syra's golden eyes softened. She glanced away for a moment, as if unsure of herself. Then she turned back to him. I have no one left. I'm alone. Her words hung in the air like a weight. Nathan didn't know how to respond. But as he looked at her, sitting across from him, he realized something. She wasn't just some alien anymore. She was a person. Someone who had lost everything, just like him. Not anymore, Syra. Not anymore. The next morning, the sky above them was a dull gray, the sun hidden behind thick clouds. Nathan packed up his things, checking his supplies and preparing for the next leg of their journey. Syra was still resting, her body weak from hunger, but her condition had improved slightly. She wasn't shaking as much, and her golden eyes no longer had that hollow, distant look. She was awake now, sitting against a crumbled wall, watching him. Nathan zipped up his bag and glanced at her, ready to move. Syra nodded slowly, but her eyes remained cautious. She was still sizing him up, trying to figure him out. Nathan didn't mind. He knew that trust was something that didn't come easily, especially not between two beings from different worlds. As they stood to leave, Syra took a few shaky steps, wincing in pain as she put weight on her legs. Nathan saw her struggle and immediately moved to help. He didn't ask, he just offered his arm for support. Syra hesitated, her pride battling her need for help. For a long moment, she didn't take it. She seemed to be weighing her options, trying to decide if she could continue on her own. "I can walk." Her voice was firm, but there was a hint of doubt in it. Nathan didn't press her. He simply shrugged, slinging his pack over his shoulder and starting to walk. He knew she wouldn't let herself fall behind for long. They walked in silence for a while, the only sound being the crunch of their footsteps on the dry, cracked earth. The air was still, and the planet around them seemed to hold its breath, waiting. Eventually, Syra's steps grew slower, and Nathan could see her fighting to keep her balance. Without a word, he stopped and turned to face her. "All right," he said. "Let me help." She glared at him, but she didn't argue. She was too tired to keep pretending that she didn't need help. She finally took his arm, leaning on him for support. Nathan wasn't sure if it was her pride or her strength, but it felt like a small victory, one she hadn't given up lightly. As they walked together, Nathan noticed the change in her. The walls around her, the ones that had been built from years of pride and anger, were slowly starting to crack. She was still distant, but she wasn't fighting him anymore. "Why are you doing this?" she asked quietly, breaking the silence. Nathan glanced at her. "Doing what?" "Helping me." Her voice was still cautious, but there was curiosity in her tone now, not just distrust. He smiled, though it wasn't a full smile. It was more of a shrug. "Like I said before, you needed it." Syra didn't respond right away, but Nathan could see the gears turning in her mind. The questions that had been bubbling inside her, about him, about humans, were starting to surface. She glanced at him once more, her golden eyes softer than before. "You're different." Nathan chuckled. "Yeah, I get that a lot." They walked for hours, traveling across the barren land. With every step, Syra grew stronger. Nathan could tell that she was starting to push herself more, but he also saw something else. She wasn't just relying on him anymore. She was starting to trust him, little by little. It was a fragile trust, but it was a start. By the time they reached a small settlement, Syra was walking on her own again, though she was still a little wobbly. Nathan smiled to himself, thinking that maybe, just maybe, they might make it off this planet alive. The small settlement they arrived at was nothing more than a few broken-down buildings and the remains of a burned-out campfire. Nathan glanced around, eyes scanning the area for any signs of danger. The planet might be dying, but there were still threats lurking around every corner. He didn't trust this place. Syra walked beside him, more steady now, her movements less stiff and more confident. She looked around, her golden eyes sharp, but there was a sense of unease in her posture. She was ready to fight, but she didn't know what they were up against yet. Nathan motioned to a building nearby. "We should check that structure for supplies. If we're lucky, we might find something useful." Syra nodded, but she was still on edge. The war had left its mark on her, and every shadow, every sound made her jump. She had been betrayed before, abandoned by her own people, and she didn't know if she could trust anyone, not even a human. As they approached the building, Nathan motioned for Syra to stay close. He moved quietly, his instincts sharp from years of survival in hostile territories. Syra, despite her initial reluctance, followed his lead. They reached the entrance, and Nathan cautiously pushed the door open, half expecting it to collapse in on them. Inside, the building was empty, save for some old crates and pieces of metal. Nothing useful. But just as Nathan was about to turn and leave, a noise broke the stillness. Footsteps. Syra's head snapped to the side, her body tensing. She pulled her weapon from its holster with a speed that surprised Nathan. "What is it?" Nathan whispered, his hand going to his own weapon. "Scavengers." Syra's voice was low, filled with a cold certainty. Nathan's heart skipped a beat. The scavengers were ruthless. They didn't care who they hurt or who they killed to get what they wanted. And worse, they weren't afraid to attack first. From around the corner, two figures appeared, alien, but not the type Syra was used to. These were human-looking, though their features were rough and scarred, as if the planet had taken a toll on them. They were wearing ragged clothing, their eyes sharp and calculating. One of them grinned. Well, what have we here?" Nathan didn't wait for them to get closer. He stepped in front of Syra, his posture defensive. "Back off. We're not interested in trouble." The scavenger with the grin stepped forward, looking Nathan up and down. "Not interested? Funny. You're in my territory now. Human. That means you pay the price for trespassing." The other scavenger, a tall man with a scar across his face, pulled out a long, jagged knife, twirling it in his hand as he stared at Syra. "You two are alone out here, aren't you?" he said, his voice low and menacing. "A woman like her, you'd be a fool not to share her." Syra's eyes narrowed in fury, and Nathan felt a surge of protectiveness. This wasn't the first time someone had tried to make her an object, and Nathan wasn't about to let it happen again. "Touch her, and I'll show you how much I'm not interested," Nathan growled, stepping forward with authority. He might be a human, but he wasn't afraid. Not now. Not with her beside him. The scavenger with the scar smirked, but didn't move. For a moment, there was only the tension between them, thick as smoke. And then, just as the scavenger raised his knife to make a move, a loud, distant roar echoed through the air. It sounded like something monstrous, something angry. The scavengers froze. "What was that?" the scared man asked, looking around nervously. Nathan glanced at Syra, who was suddenly looking even more concerned. Not good. They had no idea what they were up against, but one thing was clear. The scavengers were no longer the biggest threat. The distant roar echoed again, louder this time. It wasn't human, and it wasn't a scavenger. Something bigger, much more dangerous, was out there. Nathan could feel the air shift. Tension, panic. The scavengers looked at each other, fear creeping into their eyes. What the hell was that? The scared scavenger muttered, his knife still in hand but now lowered. The other scavenger, a thinner man with dark, hollow eyes, stepped back, his eyes darting around. Could be a wild beast, or worse. Nathan didn't wait to find out. He grabbed Syra's arm, pulling her back toward the exit. "We need to move. Now." Syra didn't argue. She could feel it too. Whatever was out there, it was far more dangerous than any scavenger. She followed Nathan without a word, her mind racing. She had survived battles, escaped enemies. But this was different. They burst out of the building, running toward the cover of the crumbling ruins, the sound of the scavengers' footsteps echoing behind them. Nathan didn't look back. He knew the scavengers weren't interested in them anymore. The creature out there was their real threat now. "What was that?" Syra panted, her voice filled with concern as they sprinted through the wreckage. "I don't know," Nathan admitted, looking over his shoulder as they ran. "But it sounds big. and I don't plan on finding out. They made their way to a narrow alleyway between two collapsed buildings, the walls offering some shelter. Nathan paused, peeking around the corner. The scavengers were nowhere to be seen, but they couldn't stay in the open for long. They needed a plan, and they needed it fast. "We can't stay here," Nathan said, his voice urgent. "We need to find shelter, maybe an old hideout or something." Syra nodded, but her eyes were sharp, still scanning the surroundings. "I know a place. It's not far from here." Nathan raised an eyebrow. "You sure? The scavengers might still be after us." Syra's eyes flickered with determination. "I'm sure. It's safer than staying here. Trust me." Without waiting for Nathan's response, she led the way, moving quickly but carefully through the ruins. The roar from earlier faded, but the eerie silence that followed made Nathan uneasy. Whatever it was, it hadn't given up on hunting them down. After a few tense minutes, they arrived at a collapsed building, half covered in sand and debris. Syra gestured for Nathan to follow her through a small opening in the wall. Inside, it was dark and musty, the air thick with dust. But there was a small space at the back, enough to hide in for a while. They ducked inside and quickly closed the entrance behind them. Syra turned to Nathan, her face tense. "We wait here until dark. Then we move." Nathan nodded. "What are we waiting for?" "That thing out there. It could be gone by nightfall, or it could be closer. We don't take any chances." He understood. Syra wasn't just being cautious. She was used to surviving. And Nathan was learning that the best way to survive was to listen to her. They sat in the dark, barely speaking, waiting for the sound of the unknown creature to fade into the distance. Every so often, they heard distant footsteps or another eerie growl, but neither of them moved. The tension in the air was thick, and both of them knew they couldn't afford to make a mistake. As the hours dragged on, Nathan couldn't help but feel a growing sense of unease. They were in the clear, for now, but the world around them was falling apart, and the only thing that was certain was that they had to keep moving. The night stretched on, the silence broken only by the occasional distant growl of whatever beast had been hunting them. Nathan and Syra sat in the dark, backs pressed against the cold walls of their shelter. Time seemed to slow, the air thick with uncertainty. Neither of them spoke much. The silence was a comfort, yet it was also a reminder of how fragile their situation was. Nathan shifted uncomfortably, his mind racing through possible plans. They couldn't stay in the ruins forever, but they had no way of knowing when it would be safe to leave. The scavengers were still out there somewhere, and whatever creature had roared earlier might still be nearby, prowling the area. Finally, Syra broke the silence. Her voice was low, hesitant, as though she wasn't sure if she should speak at all. "I used to believe in the strength of my people." She paused, staring at her hands, which rested on her lap. "We're warriors. We're supposed to be strong." Nathan turned to look at her, his curiosity piqued. It was the first time she had shared anything personal, anything that revealed just how much she had lost. He stayed quiet, waiting for her to continue. Syra let out a long, shaky breath, and when she spoke again, her voice trembled slightly. "But when they left me behind, when they abandoned me, I started to wonder if that strength was just a lie." Nathan's heart went out to her. He could see the pain in her eyes, the deep wound that no amount of survival skills could heal. He couldn't fully understand what it felt like to be betrayed by your own people, but he knew what it felt like to be alone, to feel abandoned in a world that didn't care. "I get it," he said softly. "I've been there too." Syra turned to look at him, her golden eyes narrowing in confusion. "You? A human?" Nathan nodded. "Yeah, a long time ago, my team left me behind. I was stranded on a hostile planet with no backup, no support. It was every man for himself." He paused, his voice quieter now. "I guess you could say I learned that survival is everything." Syra looked at him for a long moment, as if she was seeing him in a new light. Then, without warning, she shifted closer to him, her body language still cautious but less defensive than before. "How did you survive?" she asked, her voice softer now, filled with curiosity. Nathan smiled a little, but there was no joy in it. "By doing whatever it took. You learn to be resourceful, to trust your instincts. It's not pretty, but you find a way to keep going." Sci-Fi studied him closely, her gaze searching, as though trying to understand his story. "And what about after that? When the fight's over, when you've survived? What happens then?" ***. Nathan's smile faded. "That's the hard part. After everything, you're left with nothing but memories. The battles, the losses, they never really go away. They stay with you." He paused, his mind briefly flashing back to his old team, to the mission gone wrong. He forced the memory down. "But you learn to keep moving. You don't have a choice." For the first time since they'd met, Sci-Fi seemed to relax, her guard lowering. It was a small thing, but it was enough. She wasn't just an alien anymore. She wasn't just a warrior who had been abandoned. She was someone who had been through the same kind of pain and loss as him. "I don't know how much longer I can keep going like this," Sci-Fi admitted quietly, her voice almost a whisper. Nathan didn't have an answer for her. He couldn't promise things would get better. But he could offer her something that she might not have expected: companionship and the knowledge that she wasn't alone anymore. "You don't have to do it alone anymore," Nathan said. "We'll figure this out together." Sarah met his gaze, her expression softening. For the first time, the distance between them seemed to vanish. She wasn't just a Valeri warrior. She wasn't just the enemy. She was just another person trying to survive in a world that didn't care. And maybe, just maybe, they could both find a way out of this together. The morning came slowly, the sky still dark with lingering clouds, a stark contrast to the quiet tension between Nathan and Sci-Fi. They had spent the night in the crumbling building, hidden away from the dangers outside, but neither of them had slept well. The uneasy silence of the planet had only grown louder as the hours dragged on. They both knew they couldn't stay here forever. Nathan stood up, stretching his sore muscles. He could feel the weight of their situation. The scavengers were still out there, and whatever creature had roared earlier wasn't far behind. "We need to move," Nathan said, checking his equipment and pulling his pack onto his back. Sci-Fi, who had been silently watching him, nodded. "Agreed. The longer we stay here, the more dangerous it becomes." She didn't add anything else, but Nathan could see the worry in her eyes. They both understood the stakes. They left the building quietly, sticking to the shadows as they made their way through the abandoned settlement. The air was heavy, each step echoing in the emptiness. "I know a place," Sci-Fi said suddenly, her voice low. "A hidden base. It's not far from here." Nathan turned to her, a questioning look in his eyes. "Hidden? From whom?" "From everyone. It's safe," she replied, her face hardening. "But I need to get to it before the scavengers do." Nathan hesitated. Something about the way she spoke made him uneasy. "What exactly is it, Sci-Fi? Why is it so important?" Sci-Fi's expression tightened. "I told you before. I was part of a scouting team. That base was where we kept some of our best equipment. If we can get there before anyone else, it might give us a chance to survive." Nathan nodded, understanding the urgency. They had no choice. They needed resources, and the base might hold something that could turn the tide in their favor. But as they approached the outskirts of the settlement, the sound of footsteps reached their ears. Nathan's hand instinctively went to his weapon. "It's them." Sci-Fi's voice was tight, her eyes scanning the area. "The scavengers?" Nathan asked, already preparing to fight. Sci-Fi nodded, her jaw clenched. "They'll be here soon. We can't let them get to the base first." Nathan's heart raced. He didn't want to fight, but it looked like there was no other option. They had to move fast. Just as they began to pick up the pace, one of the scavengers appeared from around a corner. He was followed by another, and then another. They were closing in quickly. Nathan stepped forward, blocking Sci-Fi's path. "Stay back. I'll handle this. Syra's eyes flashed with anger. I can fight too, you know. Nathan shook his head. Not yet. We need to get to that base. I'll hold them off as long as I can. The scavengers approached, and one of them smirked. You again. Nathan didn't hesitate. He fired a warning shot into the air. The scavengers froze, momentarily stunned. Back off. Nathan's voice was firm, his weapon aimed at them. We're not your targets today. But the smirk never left the leader's face. You think you can scare us off, human? He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small device. Nathan's eyes widened in horror. It was a grenade. Before Nathan could react, the scavenger activated the device. And then, everything went dark. The blast hit with an explosive force, throwing Nathan and Syra to the ground. The world around them went silent for a moment, filled only with ringing in their ears. Nathan's head spun, and he struggled to push himself up, his vision blurred. The smell of smoke and burning debris filled the air, stinging his lungs. Sarah groaned next to him, her body limp but breathing. Nathan's heart raced. Had she been hurt? He grabbed her arm, pulling her into his arms as he staggered to his feet. Syra, Nathan hissed, shaking her gently. Her eyes fluttered open, dazed but alive. I'm fine, just stunned. Her voice was weak, but she didn't sound like she was in serious pain. Nathan let out a relieved breath, his hands trembling. The scavengers had launched the grenade, but now the sound of their footsteps faded as they retreated into the chaos. Nathan knew they couldn't stay here. The blast had made enough noise to attract more attention, and the scavengers would definitely be back with more dangerous weapons. We need to go. Nathan pulled Syra to her feet, his arm around her waist to help steady her. She winced but nodded, her golden eyes sharp once again. Where? She asked, looking around, her voice tight with urgency. There's a base nearby. We'll head there, Nathan said, his mind already calculating the best route. They couldn't afford to waste time. The air was thick with smoke and dust, and as they stumbled through the wreckage, the distant sounds of explosions echoed in the background. Nathan gripped his weapon tightly, scanning their surroundings for any sign of the scavengers or worse, the creature that had been lurking nearby. We won't make it if we don't move faster. Syra's voice was strained, but she was keeping up, her pace steady despite the shock of the explosion. Nathan's mind was racing. They had to get to the base quickly, but the scavengers would know exactly where they were headed. They'd have to fight. The blast had left a trail of destruction, and every step seemed more dangerous than the last. The ground was uneven, littered with debris, and the air was thick with dust. They could hear distant cries, either from the scavengers or perhaps the creature still hunting them. Nathan spotted a narrow alley ahead. It wasn't ideal, but it was a good place to hide, to regroup. He motioned to Syra, who nodded, following him without hesitation. As they ducked into the alley, Nathan's heart pounded. They were cornered, but he wasn't about to give up. Not when he had come this far. Not when Syra had come this far. You stay here. I'll keep watch, Nathan whispered, his eyes scanning the end of the alley. You can't do this alone. Syra's voice was firm, stronger now. I can fight. Nathan looked at her. There was no fear in her eyes now, only the same fierce determination that had kept her alive through so much. He knew she wasn't going to stay behind, no matter what he said. All right, together then, Nathan said, his voice low but resolute. They took their positions, side by side, ready for whatever was coming. The scavengers wouldn't back down easily, but neither would they. The quiet that followed was more dangerous than the roar of any creature. The air was thick with tension, each passing moment bringing them closer to the inevitable clash. The silence was suffocating. Nathan and Sarah stood side by side in the narrow alley, their weapons drawn and eyes sharp, scanning the shadows. They didn't speak. Words were unnecessary now. Every breath, every movement was calculated. They were ready, prepared to face whatever was coming. In the distance, the muffled sound of footsteps reached their ears. The scavengers were coming, and Nathan could hear the heavy thud of boots crunching over rubble. They were getting closer. Sci-Fi glanced at Nathan, her golden eyes locked on his, her expression unreadable but intense. Nathan gave a small nod, signaling that they were ready. There was no turning back. A figure appeared at the end of the alley, his eyes scanning the surroundings. The scavenger leader from earlier. The one who had thrown the grenade. He was followed by two others. Their weapons were drawn, ready for a fight. But Nathan was faster. He raised his gun, pointing it directly at the leader. "Stay back." Nathan's voice was low but firm, his eyes never leaving the leader's face. "You won't get anything from us." The leader smirked, unfazed by Nathan's stance. "You think you can stop us, human?" He sneered, his voice filled with contempt. "You're not leaving this place alive." Nathan's grip tightened on his weapon. He wasn't sure if they could win, but he knew they couldn't just give up. The base Sci-Fi had mentioned was still their only chance. They needed to get to it, and fast. But just as the standoff reached its peak, another roar echoed through the air, louder than before. The scavengers froze, their attention shifting from Nathan and Sci-Fi to the source of the sound. "What the hell is that?" one of the scavengers muttered, his voice trembling. Nathan's eyes widened as he turned his head toward the sound. There in the distance, a massive creature emerged from the shadows, its eyes glowing a fierce red, its body covered in scales as black as night. It was unlike anything Nathan had ever seen, huge, fast, and terrifying. The scavengers panicked. One of them fired a shot, but the creature didn't even flinch. Instead, it roared again, charging toward them. The scavengers scattered, trying to escape, but the creature was faster. Nathan's heart raced. This was their chance. He turned to Sci-Fi. "Now's our time. Let's go." Without hesitation, they sprinted toward the opposite end of the alley, ignoring the chaos behind them. The creature's roar filled the air, but they didn't look back. They had one goal: reach the base. They ran, their legs burning, but they didn't stop. They couldn't afford to. Every step brought them closer to safety. Finally, they reached the entrance to the base, an old rusted door barely hanging on its hinges. Nathan pushed it open, the squeal of metal cutting through the air. They stumbled inside, slamming the door shut behind them. For a moment, they stood there, panting, staring at each other in the dim light. The sounds of the creature's roars faded as the door held firm. Sci-Fi's chest rose and fell with each breath, but her eyes were different now. There was no more anger, no more distrust. There was something else in her gaze, gratitude, and maybe something more. "Thank you, Nathan." Her voice was softer than before, filled with a quiet sincerity. Nathan smiled, feeling the weight of everything they had gone through. He didn't know what would come next, but for the first time in a long while, he wasn't alone. They had made it this far together. And maybe, just maybe, they could survive whatever came next.